Hello, folks, and welcome to Kudlow. I'm Larry Kudlow. Well, I wish to begin tonight with my sincerest condolences to the family of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and to the people of Japan. Over my 3 years in government, I got to know him well. He was head and shoulders above all the heads of state that I met. He was a brilliant politician. He was a great leader of Japan. President Trump, with whom I spoke earlier today, regarded Mr. Abe as his closest friend and ally. I once witnessed in a UN bilateral meeting with Mr. Trump and Mr. Abe the single best presentation I ever saw in my 3 years as NEC director and international Sherpa. Mr. Abe calmly presented my boss with a roughly 50-page chart book showing clearly that Japan is America's top investor and manufacturer. Indeed, more Japanese cars are made in the U.S. than in Japan. In fact, more Japanese cars were made in the U.S. than several of U.S. car makers. Jaws dropped in that room while the Japanese Prime Minister went through his paces. And talk of trade protectionism was cast aside permanently, and instead the Abe chart book opened the door to several U.S.-Japanese trade improvement deals. Mr. Abe was always kind to me personally, especially my brief and thankfully minor cardiac episode years back, where every time he saw me in the White House, at meetings at the G7 or the G20 or the UN, he would always come up and see how I was doing. And I appreciated that very much. Mr. Abe was a great Japanese patriot, America's most loyal supporter. And in plain English, he's what you call a great man. Again, my condolences to his family and the entire Japanese nation. May God watch over him, and may he rest in peace. Later in the show, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien will be with us to tell us much more about this hideous assassination and the potential consequences to the free world and the U.S.-Japanese relationship. Please stay tuned for it. Now, next up on my riff list tonight, today's jobs report virtually guarantees a 75 basis point Fed policy rate hike in 3 weeks later this month. And I think another 75 basis point rate hike in September, which would bring it to 3.25%. That is still way below the base inflation rate. That is about 6%. The Fed right now is more determined to fight inflation rather than recession, or so says Jay Powell, who has recently regained his price stability manhood and is daily growing new hair on his chest. But today's jobs report was not as strong as many seem to think. While revised non-farm payrolls did increase by 300,000, a very decent number, the household survey fell by 315,000, and over the past 3 months, household employment has dropped by 116,000. This survey depends more on family members and small businesses. It is frequently a leading indicator at turning points in the economy. Also, keep in mind, production worker wages increased at 6.4% over the past year, but that's 2 percentage points below the consumer price index inflation rate. So working folks are being paid more, but it buys less. And disposable income after inflation is down 3.3% for the past year. So I still think we're on the front end of a recession. Caveat emptor. Which brings me to my third riff this evening. It is sheer folly, given high inflation and a likely recession. It is sheer folly for the Biden Democrats to float a $1 trillion spending spree accompanied by a $1 trillion tax hike. The spending will steepen inflation, and the tax hike will deepen recession. And this new scheme they're floating to extend the 3.8% net investment tax to pass-through companies like LLCs or wholly owned proprietorships or subchapter S companies, essentially smaller business. Then they want to put that money into general revenues, and then they're going to swear up and down to the American people that it's really going to finance the Medicare hospital fund, not new domestic spending. I think it's just a big phony gimmick. That fund is supposed to be, and historically, have been financed by payroll taxes, not general revenues. So this would be a big break from the past. They're going to have to somehow create language that would earmark or designate that these taxpayer funds would, in fact, go to Medicare. And then they got to convince the reconciliation people to score it. And that's one of the many gimmicks likely to come in this insane Build Back Smaller plan. So I'll just say right at the top, save America. Kill the bill.